What is the craziest war tactic used in history? When the Anzacs pulled out of Gallipoli, they converted some of their rifles to be self-firing, using string to pull the trigger and water dripping out of a can for the timer, and left them behind to make it seem like they were still occupying their abandoned trenches. So for a few hours, the Ottomans were defending against well-armed beef tins. The Persian Empire was noted as putting their largest men on their smallest ponies and organizing them into parade units. Enemy cities saw them from far off and thought that they were giants riding normal-sized horses, and would often either give up or it would lower morale just enough in order to get the upper hand. During WW2, U.S. submarine commanders were generally only allowed 4 war patrols out of fear that they would either become too ambitious or too cautious after too many patrols. However, CMDR Eugene Lucky Flucky of the USS Barb begged for and was granted a 5th war patrol. He then immediately asked that rocket launchers be fitted to the Barb. Already famous for his tactic of maximum harassment, Flucky became the first submarine commander to fire rockets at shore targets. But he didn't stop there, noticing a supply train on one of the shores he watched. Unable to use his rockets on it, Flucky sent 8 of his sailors ashore to rig a bomb under the tracks. As the landing party returned to the Barb, the train set off the bomb and was launched 200 feet into the air. This was the only time Allied forces landed on the Japanese home islands during WW2, and the only known time a submarine has sank a train. Flucky was a wild man, though. On his way back to port without any torpedoes left, he was one sunk ship away from winning a bet, so he rammed the Barb right into it. During World War II, Japan floated hot air balloons containing incendiary devices across the Pacific Ocean, hoping to start forest fires. No fires were started, but one did explode and kill a few civilians. The media was not allowed to report on it, which eventually led to Japan abandoning the tactic because they were hoping to hear results on the US news. I can't believe no one has mentioned this yet, but Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was having a hell of a time getting into an engagement with the French Navy. Then one day, the French finally committed to a battle after sailing out of a Spanish port, with the Spanish Navy at their sides. The total battle line was 27 British ships against 33 ships of the combined French and Spanish navies. The Allied fleet formed a huge defensive line and invited Nelson to try to attack it. Come at me, bro. Now, when talking about naval engagements, you'll often hear of the term crossing the TA. It was general tactical knowledge at the time that your best bet for winning a naval engagement was to cross the other party's T, basically allowing your own ships to give a maximum broadside to the front ships of your enemy's line formation. Attacking as a line into the teeth of a bunch of broadsides was considered suicidal. But good old Nelson was convinced of the superiority of the British Navy over every other navy in the world, and he was bound to prove that shit. So, what did Nelson do? He yelled YOLO and, after dividing his command into 2 line formations, fucking charged his ships straight at the Allied defense, thus crossing his own T, with his own ship, the HMS Victory, leading one of his 2 lines. His ship and the other lead British ship took terrible hits, but they reached and broke through the French and Spanish line. But get this, when his 2 lines broke through, they kept right on sailing, which cut the French and Spanish Navy into 3 parts, in between his own 2 lines. Suddenly, the French and Spanish navies were having their own T's crossed, with British ships firing all guns and giving full broadsides in both directions as they sailed right on through to the other side. As the smoke finally started to settle, 22 ships of the Spanish and French navies were destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost that day. Nelson, who died later that day from a bullet wound, and the British Navy sailed into history that day as eternal badasses. Biological warfare. The earliest documented incident of the intention to use biological weapons is recorded in Hittite texts of 1200 BCE, in which victims of tularemia were driven into enemy lands, causing an epidemic. The Assyrians poisoned enemy wells with the fungus ergot, though with unknown results. Scythian archers dipped their arrows and Roman soldiers their swords into excrements, and cadavers victims were commonly infected by tetanus as a result. In 1346, the bodies of Mongol warriors of the Golden Horde who had died of plague were thrown over the walls of the besieged Crimean city of Kaffa. How the Australians cracked the Hindenburg Line in 1918. Step 1. At 5 a.m., fire a shit ton of gas into German lines. Germans get into gas masks and get ready to be attacked. Step 2. Don't attack. Repeat every day for a month. Germans will get used to the routine. Step 3. After 3 weeks, at 5 a.m. fire a shit ton of smoke shells and send 30,000 screaming Anzacs through the haze at masked up and confused Germans. Step 4. Be back for breakfast. Persian general was stuck besieging a city whose walls were impenetrable. So, unbeknownst to him, one of his high commanders cuts off his own nose and one of his ears. He then goes before the general, who is a bit disturbed, asking why his commander would do this. The commander says that it is part of his plan, and he knew that the general wouldn't be on board with it if he asked first. The commander then informs the general that he will go before the king of the enemy city and claim that the general did this to him, and that he would like to betray said general for this mutilation. The commander then told the general to send his weakest men to a specific place so that the commander, leading the enemy forces, could win a major victory, solidifying his place with the enemy city. The commander would then take over watch of one of the gates and simply let in the general's army. Save for a few hiccups, it worked and the city was destroyed. In the War of 1812, the British Canadians were trying to take Detroit, but were severely outnumbered. They only had a couple hundred British soldiers and a few hundred militia and native warriors. They couldn't wait because another American force was on the way. So as they set up camp across the river, they dug trenches and would march by in full view of the Americans, then duck into the trench and sneak back to march by again. At night, they would light extra fires, and at dinner time they would do the same trench trick, the same guys repeatedly lining up to get pretend food. They also gave extra British uniforms to the Canadian militiamen, so it looked like there were thousands of British soldiers. The Americans had men, but not the supplies or morale, to endure a siege against an apparently superior British force. So they surrendered the fort without a fight. Julius Caesar's plan at the Battle of Alesia is so bizarre. Can't believe the dude actually pulled off this strategy. During the final act of the war in Gaul, the Romans had the Gauls' army and their chieftain Vercingetorix trapped in the town of Alesia. Instead of assaulting the city, Caesar decided to go ahead with a classic siege to starve the enemy. He then decided that a normal siege wasn't enough, so he had his army build a 10 m high wall with watchtowers around the entire city. Perfect plan, right? No one can get out. The city is fenced in low. Unfortunately, words got out to a second Gaul army that Vercingetorix and his troops were in trouble in Alesia. This army was heading straight for Alesia and was threatening to break the Roman siege. So Julius Caesar had another wild idea. Let's build a second wall around our Roman army in the first wall, so we can block the incoming Gaul army and keep the Alesia siege going. What? Roman soldiers built that second high wall again in record time, and the Gaul army that was supposed to save Alesia was instead welcomed by insane fortifications. They tried pushing through, but the Roman defeated them, thanks to Caesar's super wall. Vercingetorix and his soldiers also tried to break the wall. Couldn't do it. He surrendered to the Romans, and Gaul was finally conquered. Siege of Kruye in Albania, 1450. One night during the siege, Skanderbeg sent out a herd of goats with a candle on each of the goats' horns. The encamped Turks believed it to be an Albanian attack and made a movement against the herd. When the Turks advanced far enough, Skanderbeg launched an attack against the force, destroying it. After the siege was lifted, Skanderbeg commemorated his victory by designing a helmet with the head of a goat on it, as a reference to his ingenious tactics used that night. The entire story of Skanderbeg is astonishing. Every step,